So today we're talking about native landscape design, and our objectives are to understand the principles of landscaping for nature and then resources for purchasing native plants. And for your information, this is closed gentian, one of my favorite plants. This will bloom, that is the bloom, and bumblebees are one of the few pollinators that can pry open the flower petals and get in there and pollinate. And this will stay blooming till like December. So today's lecture, I am a trained wildlife biologist. I know wildlife management. Design isn't my forte, but based on my experience in my own yard and then what I've learned from planting in a post-wild world, that's what I'm basing a lot of this lecture off of today. So I highly recommend this book. I know the library has it, so check it out. I will also be posting on our resources page on the website some helpful flyers that talk about the same elements that we'll be talking about today. So native landscaping is the practice of translating the essential elements of a wild plant community into a designed garden. So we're using nature as our guide, and you do that by selecting a model landscape that's based on your existing site conditions and the key elements you'd like to have in your garden. So even if you want a woodland in your yard, you may not have the proper conditions to have a woodland garden there. And so this is about working with what we've got and using nature as our guide. So we're gonna use my backyard from 2020 as an example. The conditions of this site, it's on the northeast corner of my yard, so it gets about 6 hours of sun, 6 hours of shade. It's on the downgrade heading towards the neighbors, and the soil is straight up clay. There's nothing else there. Who's got that in their yard? Is it wet when it rains, and it stays wet, and then when it dries out, it's as hard as a rock? That's what this site is. And this shed was there when we bought the house, and we're getting rid of it. 2020 yard. So what is our model landscape for that site? Now, if you had a hot, dry, full sun, rocky, thin soil site, maybe you consider a glade as your model landscape. These are natural communities that are found in open woodland areas, typically on the top of a hill, on the southwest facing side of the hill, so they're getting full sun. They're very desert-like conditions. And in southern Missouri, we have very specific animals that live there, like tarantulas and scorpions. Yes, we have those in Missouri, just in the southern part. And then we have our prairies, which, when you're thinking of the essential elements of a prairie, you think tall grasses, tall wildflowers. Prairies can have sandy soil, wet soil, dry soil, deep soil. And so you have a variety of these different plants with a few scattered shrubs across the landscape and very few trees. In a woodland, woodlands have an open canopy. So some sunlight is able to penetrate the ground, which allows things like shrubs and ground flora, flowers and grasses to grow. So you have a really dense understory. And I think of it in a woodland, you really can't walk off trail easily. You have to go through a bunch of brambles. And then in a forest, because it's a closed canopy, you have large, tall, mature trees and several mid-story trees. They create a cover that doesn't allow light to penetrate down into the ground flora, so you have a very thin understory, so it's easy to walk off trail. A stream edge is characterized by an open gap along flowing water. And stream edges are interesting because they're used to frequent flooding, floods that bring in sediments and then also take them away. So you have an ever-changing soil profile. So these plants, like silver maple, pawpaw, Virginia bluebells, they can handle various conditions. They can handle some mud, clay soils. They can handle sandy soils. They're used to that ever-changing soil profile. And in a wetland, you have soils that are saturated. These water levels will fluctuate seasonally, so sometimes it may dry up, sometimes it may be inundated for months. So again, these plants are used to that ebb and flow that nature creates. So things like aquatic species like bald cypress, river birch, our water lilies, which you can see these little pink dots, and then one of my favorite is the arum. Those are straight up aquatic plants that need to live in submerged water. As you're looking at these pictures, as you go out and visit these sites, take note of what you like. Go during different seasons. Nature looks different throughout the year, and so will your native landscape. And lastly, we'll talk about savannas. So savannas are the transition zone between prairies and woodlands, so they have the best of both worlds. You have tall grasses and wildflowers with a handful of large trees spread across the landscape. And these trees usually have long branches that reach out wide because they have the space to grow. Okay, so we went through those model landscapes. I told you about the site conditions. Now with the person sitting next to you, let's talk about what model landscape would you choose for this site? We'll take about 5 minutes and then we'll come back together.
Okay, sounds good. All right, guys. I'm sure you all have a lot to talk about because this is all very interesting. So who wants to share first? We're just going to take like maybe 5 people, not a lot.
Okay, so the 3 of us, I think, similar, down near that fence where it's supposed to grade down stream edge because it looks like water's collecting, and then up where it up higher on the grade, more glady kind of things because it's the soil, the way the soil is.
So it took me a minute to realize that the clues were in there. The river birch, bald cypress, and silver maple had been named in some of the other pictures. But see, someone up here was taking photographs and I didn't. So stream edge or wetland or some other parts, depending on, like they said, once you move the shed, that soil may be very different.
I used wetlands and stream edge as my model landscape. In 2020, we had quite a bit of rain, so I didn't get to see the dryness of the site as much as we are now. So this model landscape, it is our plant list. It is our color palette. This is our guide for creating our garden. You don't have to be a natural history biologist to create a native landscape using this methodology. So Grow Native, I brought this up in my last presentation. They have a native landscape database, and one of the criteria that they have is native environment. So you can just select what your model landscape is, and a list of plants that exist in that habitat will pop up, and that's your starting point.
It is awesome. I hear people saying it's awesome. But I also wanted to ask a question. How did you, in your discussion with your family, or when you made the decision to put it down, did you have to justify it to your husband? Because I just think sometimes there's not always an agreement in your family about how
Absolutely. And fortunately for me, he was working in
my
Alaska
husband.
on a commercial fishing vessel at the time, so there was no discussion. I made that decision. And yeah, you're gonna leave me with a baby in a pandemic. I'm gonna put a rain garden in. Well, I think my picture will show up soon, but I was practicing this morning. He's like, you need to mention the stroke you nearly gave me when I came home and I saw this giant puddle of water about a foot deep right next to our foundation. And it's not right next, it's 10 feet away, which is about as close as you want to get with a rain garden. And he said, now the water hardly stays in there for a few hours because the plants have established, they've matured. I've got a variety of different species, so the root structure's varied, and some are tap roots, they're drilling down through that clay. Now that water just goes straight in there, those plants suck it up, and they actually pull the water away from our foundation.
I do like to choose your own adventure because
Yeah, remember those books?
it is an adventure.
So we have our model landscape. We know what our plant list is. Now, how do we want to design this garden? We can go the clump route, where you have a designated area, and you plant one species in that area, then you have another section, you plant another. It gives a more formal look. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If that's what you like, that's cool. You are going to have more maintenance. You're going to have to do things to keep those plants in those areas, which is a challenge with native plants because they like to do their own thing.
It's true.
Which is why vertical layering is another a route that I prefer. And so we're not planting one species in one section necessarily. We're planting in layers. So our first layer, called the structural layer, and this layer defines the model landscape. These plants in this layer are what you think of when you think of that landscape. So for like a prairie or a savanna, tall grasses, little blue stem, prairie blazing star. In a woodland, it's going to be your trees and your shrubs. These are the plants that are going to exist in your landscape through several years. They're not going to come and go like some other short-lived plants.
That is a question that someone asked me the other day. How long do perennials last? I asked her to research it. I did not know.
And so that depends on the plant, really. And so we have some perennials that are around for 3 years, some that are around for decades. So it's variable, and we learn as we go, is how I've been doing it. So the percentage on this layer, because we are designing for people and wildlife, humans, we inherently love organization.
Yeah.
So when there's too much going on in a space, it feels uncomfortable to a lot of people, which is why there can be some pushback on some native landscapes, because they're just a little too wild.
Right.
So we are using this technique to limit the wildness of the native landscape. Quick question.
What things would you be looking for in terms of, like, as you're researching the plants on that other website, like, what is going to cue me in that they're structural plants?
Yeah, so species that are larger, so taller, prairie blazing star, about 5 feet. It depends on your model landscape. In a woodland, your trees and your larger shrubs are going to be your structural species. And you're looking at long-lived. You wouldn't plant an annual and expect it to be there next year, of course. And so perennials, things that have distinct forms. And really, that's getting to the essence of the landscape. What do you think of when you say prairie? What do you think of when you say wetland? What pops into your mind? That's the essence that you want to pull out and emphasize in your garden. So long-lived, and then you're looking at height and structure. Is it, how to describe this better? Let's go through and look at some of the other layers, and maybe it'll make more sense to you. Oh, so the percentage on here, because if you have too many of the structural layer species, it will muddle the design. It'll get too crowded, and people really won't know what they're supposed to be looking at. And so you want to limit the number of plants to 10 to 15% of your total plants that you're putting on this landscape. Structure, yeah. Oh, yeah. For structural, it's 10 to 15%. So it's not a whole lot. So the next layer is your seasonal theme layer. These are species that are relatively mid-height to your structural species, and plants that become visually dominant during a certain part of the year. And so things like eastern blue star, which we talked about last time, and it's a spring blooming species, and it creates a lot of color, and then it stops blooming, and it becomes green background for everything else. So these are the species that come in, hey, wow, I'm here, and then lose their bloom, but they're still there. They are the green backdrop to everything else. And you want about 25 to 40% of your total plants to be those seasonal wow factors. So plants like Virginia bluebells, which when you see them in a woodland environment, you'll see them in large swaths across the landscape, and that's how you want to plant them. Those are the type of species, like if you're thinking of a painting, a large brushstroke across the landscape, that's the seasonal theme layer. Does that make sense?
I had a question about how to plant them. Like, again, I'm starting from seed. How to plant them. I mean, do you just throw them out there and, hope for the best? Or are you tying off a place and putting them specifically in that area?
So we'll talk more about that when we do the workshop. But you want to frame your areas, and whether that's with a hardscape, it could be something as simple as using sticks or logs. And these plants, we'll plant this, and it'll look scrappy. It's going to be a little bare in some places, but when they establish and they mature, they're going to do their own thing. So we are planting for the future. You're not going to see it when you plant it.
When you're planting natives, plan on the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, the third year they leap.
Love that.
Is that another Grow Native thing, I think? I think that's another Grow Native. And I would refine that and saying the first year, they're not sleeping, they're working, they're just doing everything underground. They're growing their roots and storing that energy. So those next few years is when they really start to go above ground.
It seems to me that gardening, especially with this perennial and long term, you have to be an optimistic person. You have to feel like it's going to be okay. Let's just keep growing, So I like being in that group.
Yeah, we've got one more comment, and we'll move on.
Keep in mind that if you're planting from seed, some of the seed does not germinate the first year. It might not germinate until 7 years after you've planted it. So, yeah, it can be a very long-term germination period.
Yeah, that's why planting from seed is a different experience than planting plugs. For a woodland environment, for a garden, your spring ephemerals like wild sweet William and Virginia bluebells, they take advantage of the sunlight before the trees grow their leaves. So they're a great seasonal theme layer plant. And now we have our ground cover, which this is where the majority of your plants are at. About 50% of your total plants are going to be in ground cover, because these are the low shade-tolerant species that fill in the spaces between the structural and the thematic layers. And so we have species for a woodland like oak sedge, and this is a great example of what oak sedge can do. It likes dry shade, which I hear often that nothing likes dry sage. Well, oak sedge loves it. Cedar sedge loves it. So it's a great plant to put in between. And then we have things like brownleaf ragwort. And in this plant, because in the springtime, it will send up this yellow shoot. So it kind of, nature, you can't put nature in a box. It's a ground cover and it's a theme layer plant. And so it's really dual purpose because it's evergreen. The basal leaves will stay once that shoot is done blooming, goes to seed. The basal leaves stay throughout the year. And this is your main functional layer. So when we think of low maintenance, it's this ground cover that's suppressing the weeds between the larger individual plants. And next we have our filler layer. So about 5 to 10% of your total plants is going to be filler, and these are short-lived plants that temporarily fill gaps. So things like your annuals, Plains coreopsis for a prairie or cardinal flower. These things will seed out. They're prolific seeders typically. They come up quickly. They're pretty, while the slower growing, longer lived perennials are doing what we said, they sleep in the first year when they're doing that underground work, when they're sleeping. It's these annuals that are, they're running the show right now. And fillers are great because even when they die out and those longer lived perennials raise up and start shading out the filler plants, that seed is locked into the seed bank. So if you have a woodland planting and a tree gets knocked down and opens up a space, those filler plants will come up out of the soil and they will fill that area while you can either replace that structural layer plant or allow something else to grow in its place. So things like annuals, biennials, short-lived perennials. We have some biennials and annuals in our plant giveaway today. This slide is just to summarize the layers. And I want to mention the last layer, layer 5, is time. So you want to remember to have something blooming in the spring, the summer, and the fall. And it doesn't have to be in each layer, but you want to make sure you have that so you have some color, something going on throughout the entire growing season.
Would this be in similar to companion planting of gardening?
Absolutely, but we have to do a lot less work, I think.
Amen. I'm loving this.
And our ultimate goal is for this mixed planting, which provides a lot more habitat. You're building soil. You're doing a lot more in this small space than if you were to plant in clumps or, have one individual plant, a foot of mulch, and then another individual plant, and so on. And it's also reducing the amount of work and effort you have to put into caring for it. So going back to my rain garden, this picture is from May of 21. So I dug this out in spring and summer of 2020, planted it in fall of 2020, and this is that spring of 21. That's what it looks like. So you can see you've got lots of spiderwort, which looks awesome right now in the springtime, but around, July, August, it's starting to look a little haggard because it's too hot. Make it go away. So not as many blooms, but that's its time. And you see the eastern blue star in the back, in the corner there. This filler species that you see is jewelweed, which in the bouquet, there's one of the blooms there. That's that tubular-looking bloom. It's an annual. It can also be used if you have a rash from poison ivy or something like that. You just rub jewelweed onto that rash. Lots of different species. This photo is from August of 21. So you can see how it's changing. That cup plant is several feet taller than it was.
Yes.
The rose mallows come up. So that's a later blooming species. These little pink blooms are all monkey flower. And then here's the jewelweed in the back. Now, I don't mind a little chaos in my yard, so I tend to let things get tall, and that's how I like it. I did mulch it just to keep. Well, there was some compromise between my husband and I to keep up that aesthetic. You don't have to mulch. It's not a bad idea, though. If you do mulch, you need to do it lightly because we want those filler species to spread their seed and be able to reach the soil. So this is it's an inch of mulch at most. And in other areas where we work to kill the grass, it's a cardboard and a 4 inches of mulch situation. So that's from a rainstorm. There's a downspout, well, you can see it in this photo, right here, that I attached something, dug a trench, buried it, and it comes out right where these irises are at. So that's water from one half of my roof that this rain garden holds and allows to seep in. Like that first year, it was a mosquito-infested cesspool, and my husband wasn't wrong. It was ugly, but now, it is something a lot more fun to look at. And so this is summer of 22, where you see the marsh milkweed is really making its showing. We've got Missouri coneflower that I've added. So I garden in bits and pieces. Like, if you had all the money in the world and you could put it all in at the one time, great. But I don't. And so, these layers come kind of piecemeal for me. Like, I have my well, you can't see it in this photo, But there's an amorpha, false wild indigo bush. That's one of my structural layers. And then the marsh milkweed is another part of the structural layer. That red in between there, that's cardinal flowers, so that's a thematic layer. The cone flowers are thematic. There's lots of tussock sedge and things underneath here that act as that ground cover.
What if you don't like it? After you finish all that, and I love it, but, what if my husband doesn't like it? And do you put a cardboard over it? How do you prevent it from...
You call me and I'll come get the plants, and then you can rip it out and cover it up.
Don't kill the plant.
So he eventually came home off the boat in Alaska, and we talked about it, and I showed him what I'm doing, and eventually got him on board. You got to convince him. And so this is... I just took this picture. You can see me standing there. I took it the other day. So here, this is all the partridge pea, and it is a filler. It's an annual, and I let it go nuts. It's about this tall, which is sort of abnormal for partridge pea. And what you can't see underneath it is about 15 other species of native plants that are under there. And I let the partridge pea go because of the drought, and it's shading some of those species that need a little more moisture. And so far, none of them have died out. So I feel optimistic about their chances, because I'm not going to water them. Maybe every once in a while if it's really, really bad, but for the most part, I don't water my gardens. Maybe once every 2 weeks if it's really hot.
Wow.
But that also means I do lose plants occasionally. You have to be okay with that. Sometimes it's more upsetting than others, like my butterfly weed. I've had to accept it will never grow in my yard. It always dies. And so I don't plant it anymore. I guess we got some time. Moving on, though, so if you want to go the extra mile, you've created your layers of habitat. You have selected plants that can grow in a small area. You have a great diversity of species, which more diversity means more insects, which means more birds, and so on. Adding a water feature is just icing on the cake. Birds love water, and they will come to your yard immediately to get that water. Squirrels love it too. Bees. I put some stones and rocks in my bird bath to allow them space to perch and drink without falling in and drowning.
And it's so entertaining to watch the wildlife and enjoy being. And those birds, I'm learning the more birds, the less mosquitoes, all of that.
I have bats that swing around.
Yes.
I have dragonflies.
Yes.
What's it, this brown thing? That's a mining bee. So leave some exposed soil in your planting, because a lot of our native bees are solitary nesters, and they nest in the ground or they bore into wood. So leave some open space for them to nest. And they typically want some sandier, easier soil to move, not compacted clay. So I might take a rake and scrape it up for them. When you're selecting your plants for your theme, for your layers, use host plants. So this is goatweed right here. I think it's an undervalued ground cover. It's hard to find in a store because lots of people just think it's a weed, and it's very hardy, and it's ground cover, and it's a host plant for butterflies. And then you never know who's living. So I don't know if you can see the little toad that's buried in there. He's over here in this area. So many times I've been surprised by little snakes or toads.
Right.
We had a raccoon that lived in the way back for a while, and I'm smack in the middle of Columbia. We got a question.
I said, what if you're I'm all about butterflies and bees, and I'm fine with bugs, but I'm not really a big fan of the birds around the yard. My dog likes to try to chase them and eat them, and then he ends up in the garden, or they try to nest under our deck and that. So is there plants can you kind of steer towards the pollinator friendly without attracting the birds, or is it just going to happen?
It's a you build it and they will come situation. And that's the first time I've heard about birds. Usually people are like, can I bring bees and butter? It's usually the bees or the wasps. And so I guess one thing you could do is don't put in a water feature. There are certain things, want to make something more inhospitable, I guess go against what I told you just now. Have a more spread out landscape, less cover, things like that. Like if you have a plant and then, don't plant densely, because it's those dense layers that create those nooks and crannies for species to hide out while something else is eating a food source that they want to go to. And so if you don't have those nooks and crannies for them to hide out in, they're less likely to visit that site.
Don't put a hummingbird feeder in your yard.
I was just wondering about deer and rabbits. Is there any way to keep those out of your native garden?
So no, it is. It's if you build it, they will come. And that's something that's part of it. Accepting a little bit of chaos in your life we are building this for wildlife, for us. It's something beautiful, and it's a service for everybody. And so deer, what they want to eat it's really relative to what they have available to them. So if it's a time of the year where there's lots of new green species out in the woods, they're less likely to come into a space and forage. Now, if it's a drought, things aren't as palatable to them. Your garden that you've been caring for, that fresh green leaves, is much more palatable than things that they can find in nature. So they're more likely to come in. So it is, without having an 8-foot tall fence, it's hard to keep them out of your space.
You put in things like pepper flakes or
bars of soap.
Seed.
Oh yeah, like human hair. I've heard there's all sorts of things I've heard of in varying degrees of success. I had an uncle who threw a stick at one and it just stared at him. Like it's really like it's hard to get rid of them.
One more. Yes, I live out in the county, and I was wondering about the proper placement for a bird bath. I have one under a big tree, and the birds just aren't interested. Should it be out in the open, or I was wondering about predators, whether where you would suggest you put a bird bath.
So I would put it out in the open because as they're flying by, they'll be able to see it. And then, predators, I take that as you're doing your job right. If you've got predators, and you get to see some really predator-prey interactions going on.
I look at it as, can we come into their house and move them out for our benefit? That's not fair, So we have to learn to integrate and, live with what we consider vermin. But they're really living creatures, and we're in their house. So we can't run them out unless...
Can we try to distract them with, beans? It seemed like in the spring I was losing a lot of natives, when they were first-year natives. Just coming out, I planted last fall. They were coming out of the ground. They were nice, tender, new plants. And so, when it came to springtime, summertime, I'm sick of, watching these plants being eaten and dug up. And I just put bean seed out and tried to distract them, but I don't know if that helped or not, or if the plants got older and it's in the summer and they don't.
Yeah, I don't know if distracting them would work. It might bring more in, if anything. In my own yard, I have moles. They very frequently dig up my newly planted plants, and I curse them, I replant them, I give them a drink, and I say, I hope you make it. because those moles are, they're tilling up that terrible clay soil. There's sometimes when they dig up parts of my yard where I actually go and harvest the soil that they've uncovered because it looks pretty good. And they are the ones that eat the larvae, the Japanese beetle larvae. So they have a place and a purpose. And you got to embrace the chaos. Was there?
I just wanted to mention there's a man named Troy Cox who has native plants. I bought 17, and he's always at the farmer's market, and a Columbia Farmers Market where I go after this program. And I've had great success. He has labels that are fabulous for each plant, and it'll say deer and rabbit resistant. So you can just look at that and work that way too.
Yep, there are some plants that are in the mint family that if you have a real deer problem, plant more mints, things that are less palatable to them. Like I said, it's all relative to what's available.
Okay, don't judge me because
No judgment here.
I have used every deterrent for deer I can think of. When I go out in the mornings after planting and everything's blooming and beautiful, the next day those blooms are mowed off. I have probably spent at least $500 trying to find something that works. Jokingly, somebody said, "You need a gun." I'm anti-gun, so I'm not going to have that. "You need a barking dog." Well, I have a cat. So Amazon, and no, I'm sure there are others, has this little motion-activated alarm, and it flashes red, which is a good deterrent in the daylight. It also has a siren that it activates, and it has gunshots. And I put it out there 2 weeks ago, and knock on every piece of wood in this church, they're still there, and they haven't bothered them. Best money I ever spent.
Well, there you go. I've never heard of one of those.
Okay.
No judgment. If you're dealing with that kind of herbivory, then you got to do what you got to do.
Hey, I just wanted to kind of go back a little bit to what you were saying about adding the water feature, and I also experience kind of the slow layering of everything growing, and I have limited resources as well, and so I actually intentionally added some of those features concurrently with my plantings because they stand out, and they've actually been a great way to attract wildlife to my urban yard, even way before the plants are doing much to do that. So I intentionally built a couple of very attractive, in my opinion, wood piles, and that means I have a place to put my trees, the fallen branches and stuff without having any yard waste, because that's one of my goals, is to have no yard waste. And so I have logs that are the edging for my gardens, and I'm always moving things around just to accommodate the growth of things as it expands, but I'm always surprised when I move something and there's a whole colony of ants or whatever. And everything that comes to my yard, I embrace, because that's the whole point of what I'm trying to do. And I think it's really easy, and I might get some haters on this one, but I just want to speak to the people that are maybe just really focused on having everything be so beautiful, because that is one of the pros, and especially if you're in a neighborhood, maybe that is something that you're trying to accomplish so that you don't get too much backlash. But if we're not focused on attracting the wildlife and supporting it, then what are we here for? That's kind of what I'm saying. So anyway, I love my bird baths, and I've got ones at all the different levels. I've got hanging ones, I've got pedestal ones, and they seem to love the saucer on the ground, so it doesn't have to be fancy.
No, not at all.
Gotta meet them where they're at.
Yeah, and that's one thing about when you're designing, before you even plant your garden, is think about what are your goals. There's no problem, there's nothing wrong with not wanting to attract more birds. There's nothing wrong with not wanting a whole bunch of wasps, but understanding that, if we go this route to a dense layered planting and we're putting in these native plants that are host plants to the larvae of these insects, and we're creating a prey base for these spiders and wasps, like, they're gonna come. And so it's a decision we have to make. If you're interested in native plants purely for the low maintenance aspect of them, like, I would tell you that the low maintenance aspect comes from how you design your garden. Like when we talked about planting in clumps, you're gonna have a single species in a large area with a single type of root structure. And so there's less soil building, there's fewer microbial activity in the soil, and so the point is that you're not going to have as ecologically functional of a landscape. So maybe a more formal approach if you want to limit some human-wildlife interactions. The deer, it's a tough one, because that's an issue caused by us getting rid of coyotes and wolves, natural predators that used to eat those animals. And so now we have to become the predator. And so that's, scaring them off is one of the best ways. I used to work for U.S. Wildlife Services, and where human wildlife damage management, we scared animals away just like that. That was the job. So all great ways, I don't want anyone to walk away from here thinking like you've been judged.
Right.
I don't want that at all. This
Right.
is for us. Like, we plant for us too. So
Right.
you do you.
Amen.
Resources for purchasing plants. Again, Grow Native, they're the best. So they have a resource guide that different landscape companies, native plant retailers. It's basically a big list of Missouri retailers that you can choose from. The closest, best place to go is Missouri Wildflower Nursery in Brazito, just south of Just City. You can order online, or you can go down there and spend tons of money. So somebody mentioned the tags, plant tags. When you're buying plants, you need to look for the botanical name. And maybe you can't pronounce it, or you don't really know what it means, but looking for the botanical name is important, because that's going to tell you if it is a straight species or not. So, like, kangaroo joey paws, I don't know what that is. And it doesn't have the botanical name that goes along with it. So how do I know what genus or species? Where does that plant come from? And it may say U.S. native on there, but is it native to Missouri? Well, I know purple coneflowers and aromatic aster and turtlehead, they all exist in Missouri, but where's that seed from? So ask your retailer where they're sourcing their seed, and you want it as close to where you live as possible. So I know I've purchased plants where the seed has come from Iowa, and that's north. I usually try to go south, but it was from southern counties of Iowa, so I figured that was okay. But I wouldn't purchase plants from Michigan or Wisconsin. Those plants they wouldn't be able to handle our summertime temperatures, even though they are the same species. Grow Native also, I couldn't find a picture of their tags, but they have specific, says Grow Native across them. Anytime you see those, you know that's a native plant. So cultivars are genetically modified species, and that's, horticulturalists have been modifying plants forever for, agriculture, for beauty, and it changes the physiology of the plant sometimes. It changes the flower color. It can change bloom time, and so it really kind of messes with the nature. And a species has gone through evolution through thousands of years, and it's a co-evolved with those insects, and now we've changed that color. Those insects may not recognize that plant as a purple coneflower because it's yellow. And so we need to be aware that cultivars, and now nativars is a new term, where natives are getting really popular, and people want them to bloom longer. The traditional way of gardening is to keep something static, in bloom forever. That's why we water, fertilize, deadhead. We don't do that with native landscaping because we recognize that it's a dynamic system, that it's always changing. Things are gonna die, things are gonna grow, and we're okay with that. And so being aware that those things exist is important for when you want to maximize the eco-benefits, the ecological function of your garden. You want those plants to be eaten by those insects, is what that means. Any questions? Tips and tricks. I'm not going to go through a lot of these because a lot of them were brought up, but some important ones. Well, I just said that one about, things are dynamic, they're going to change. The, stressors, the conditions of the environment are going to determine where your plants are going to grow. And so that's just another part of this type of gardening. Start small and grow over time. That rain garden was the first garden I put when we bought our house. Now my entire yard's covered in it. And so you start small, learn what works, what can you handle, what do you like, and build upon that. Resist the urge to fight insect pests. You don't want to build something for pollinators and then use pesticides that kill them. I have limit herbicide use because there are some invasive species, which we'll talk more about when we do the site preparation workshop. And sometimes it's a necessary evil to use to get rid of them so that you can have a successful garden. I was asked to talk more about why we don't replace dead plants unless a member of the structural or thematic layers. So those structural and thematic layers, those are the layers that define your garden design. So we want them to be there for a long time. If something like a ground cover plant, a sedge dies, don't worry about it. There's, 50% of your garden is composed of that ground cover. Something will move in and grow there. And so, we don't maintain this type of landscape. We manage it. We manage it to preserve the original design that we started with. And that's why I say develop design goals and revisit them each year to assess your progress, and also recognize that they can change, and that's okay because our landscape is changing. So an example of that is if you start out, you have a tree as part of your landscape. 10 years that tree grows up, and now it's shading out majority of your plants. Be okay with changing that to a more shade, part sun type of landscape. You're working with the plants. They're working with you to create that desired feature. And I encourage you to get out and explore natural areas to learn about our different natural communities. The Missouri Department of Conservation has a couple books on our natural communities and places that you can visit. Some aren't too far away to drive to. So you can see a prairie, like Tucker Prairie, which has never been plowed. And so there's it's a remnant prairie, so it's been there for a long time. Explore woodlands and forests. What do you like about them? What plants do you see? Take pictures, go back, identify them later, bring them to me. Now it's our favorite part of the presentation. You can look under your chair for a Show Me the Heat sticker, and that will determine who gets the free plants.
This is a fun part. We got one. Yay!
All right.
Come on up.
So if you've got your sticker.
Oh, no, not you. Come this way. Slide to the right.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me.
How many do we have?
2. So I think we had one. You don't have to bring the sticker up. It's okay.
All right.
Okay, you got it.
Come on.
Come on up. Okay. So today I have,
I know.
this is a 3-for-1 deal where we have marsh milkweed, golden glow, and partridge pea all in the same pot. Its companions consist of more golden glow, because you can never have too much, marsh milkweed, and a New England aster, as well as 1 jewelweed. So all that jewelweed in my garden started with 1 plant. And so this is a native impatient, and when the seed pod is ready, it actually explodes and spreads the seed everywhere. It's a lot of fun. Yay. And then we have on our other bags, we've got some more sun-loving species like yarrow and let me get it out here, shorter living biennial species, beard tongue. So this would be part of your thematic layer.
Beard tongue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Gray-headed coneflower, and then more oxeye sunflower. And so these will get nice and tall. They can be one of your structural layer plants. This is one that it is a prolific cedar, so it will spread, so you'll have to do some more control of its growth. But that's what we got today. And I just, one last thing to mention. A gentleman came up here and he reminded me to mention all the native plant sales that are put on generally in the spring, but you can get on Grow Native's newsletter, and they'll send a regular email and tell you about those native plant sales coming up. There's one at Bass Pro, Bradford Farms, so there's opportunities to get plants from other locations besides the ones just within the Columbia area. And I just wanted to let you all know that from the plants from the first lecture that we went through, I went and added which layer I think they belong in. So you can do a little more study. I'll get this presentation posted Monday. So, any questions? One question in the back.
Where the videos are.
Yeah, you want the website?
Where the videos are, the first citation.
Yeah, so I will send an email with it. Let me just find it and I'll post that for you, or put it up on here.
During your presentation, you were talking about attracting wildlife. You talked about some ground cover that was super hardy that you liked, and I didn't hear exactly. Did you call it goatweed?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
GOAT.
The videos, as Devin gets them finished, will be posting up here as well. So thank you all for coming. Feel free to stick around and talk a little bit. We'll see you next weekend. Yes. Nadia will be talking about native edible plants. So,
and there'll be snacks made of native edible plants.